In the last few years, the Nigeria police force has come under a lot of scrutiny and criticism, which culminated in the October 2020 protests dubbed EndSARS. The EndSARS movement called for the disbandment of a unit within the Nigeria police force known as the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, or SARS in short. The unit was accused of professional misconduct as well as a blatant abuse and disregard for human rights, with allegations ranging from extortion to extrajudicial killings. This led many people to label the Nigeria police force as representing its colonial predecessor. In this episode, we take a closer look at this said colonial predecessor, diving as we do into the history of the police in Nigeria. I'm Simon Bayani, and this is Africa in Retrospect. Welcome to episode 1 of our series on colonial police and militaries. We're going to have about 10 episodes in this series before moving to other aspects of African history. So, if you are into African history and this is your type of content, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that bell notification icon because there's a lot more where this came from. Also, feel free to leave a like and share this video to help the channel grow. Right, now that we've got all of that out of the way, let's talk about the history of the police in Nigeria. The first police force in Nigeria was established in 1861 following the British annexation of Lagos as a British colony. The Armed Hausa Police, as it was called, began with 25 men in 1861 when it was established. In 1862, the force had grown to 100 men, and by 1863, it had grown to 600 strong. Before moving forward, I think it's important to explain why this force was called the Armed Hausa Police. Apart from the obvious reason that the force was made up of men from the Hausa ethnic group, there's another important thing to consider. In the eyes of the British colonial authorities, the Hausa ethnic group was considered to be more warrior-like or more disposed to war compared to other ethnicities in Nigeria, and this was informed by what has been termed martial race theories. Martial race theories developed in the 19th century among British Army officials following the 1857 to 1858 Indian Rebellion. Certain groups such as the Scottish Highlanders, the Nepalese Gurkhas, as well as Indian Sikhs were described to have shown a lot of courage and loyalty during this Indian Rebellion. Based on the outstanding performance of these groups, an ideology developed among British Army officials, which is now known as the martial race theories. Pretty soon after that, the British started applying this martial race theory in the rest of the colonies. In West Africa, British officials in the colonial police and militaries favored the recruitment of Hausa people into these forces because they saw them as a martial group. But in reality, these martial qualities were imagined social constructs. In fact, some historians have argued that if you look closely at these martial groups or martial races across the British Empire, you will notice that most of these people came from regions that were far away and isolated from the colonial centers. And because of their marginal position within the colonial economy, these people had very little going for them, and hence the willingness to join colonial police and militaries. But then, seeing their high numbers in the police forces and militaries, the British officials labeled them as a martial group. Another thing that I would like to point out is that prior to colonization in Nigeria, there had never been an organized police force with uniforms and salaries and all of that. The emergence of such a police force coincided with the beginning of colonial rule in Nigeria, and this should tell us something. As the governor of Lagos, Henry Freeman, put it, such a police force was needed to put an end to the wars that were going on in Lagos, but also to allow or ensure a free flow of commerce through the port of Lagos. So, this tells us that the Armed Hausa Police was established to consolidate British rule, but also to protect the economic interests of the British merchants and in the process protecting British capital. In the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria, as well as the Oil River Protectorate, the establishment of police forces also followed a similar pattern. In both cases, these police forces were used to unseat powerful African rulers who were seen to be competing for commercial dominance against the British merchants, as well as the Royal Niger Company, which wanted a monopoly of trade. Colonial police forces played an important role in the creation of a centralized Nigerian colonial state. As British rule was extended throughout Nigeria, so were other police forces created, and their creation followed similar patterns as the one that I just discussed. In 1888, for example, the Royal Niger Company formed the Northern Constabulary in Lokoja. The Niger Coast Constabulary was formed in 1894 in Calabar, while 1896 saw the creation of the Lagos Police. These police forces carried out military-style expeditions throughout Nigeria, pacifying African resistance to colonial rule. By the year 1906, Nigeria was essentially divided into two administrative territories. These were the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria as well as the Colony and Protectorate of Southern Nigeria. To reflect this change, all the colonial police forces in Nigeria were amalgamated, so that by 1906 there were only two colonial police forces. These were the Northern Police Force and the Southern Police Force. This amalgamation, both territory-wise and within the police forces, was a clear sign of the aggressive expansion of British colonial rule and the drive towards the creation of a centralized colonial state. And sure enough, in 1914, the Colony and Protectorate of Southern Nigeria were merged with the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria to create a single Nigerian colonial state. The interesting thing, however, is that this change took about 16 years to reflect in the colonial police forces. It was not until 1930 that the Southern Police Force and the Northern Police Force were amalgamated to create the Nigeria Police Force. But unfortunately for the Africans, this new force still had the same outlook as well as objectives as its predecessors. Now, in terms of recruitment in the Nigeria Police Force, the appointment of European gazetted officers was the preserve of the British government. Now, what usually happened was that men who were recruited for these positions were recruited from other British colonies, or they were recruited from the civil or colonial service within Nigeria, and in some instances they would be recruited from the civil service or the armed forces of Great Britain. The reason why the Nigeria Police Force did not recruit European gazetted officers from the police forces of, say, England or Scotland was because the training and orientation in those police forces was not suitable for the colonies. The only time that a serving member of a police force in England and Scotland could be considered for the Nigeria Police Force, or any other colonial police force for that matter, was if they could prove that they had received some military training in the past. Other than that, they would be considered only if they had ever served in the Royal Irish Constabulary. The reason for this was because the Royal Irish Constabulary was the paramilitary force that the British used as a model for creating their colonial police forces. As for the recruitment of Africans in the Nigeria Police Force, there was a bit of a shift from the way things were done when the different colonies were established within Nigeria. While the earlier police forces had favored the recruitment of the Hausa ethnic group, the 1940s saw the Nigeria Police Force try to recruit from different ethnic groups across Nigeria. Even then, however, the top brass in the Nigeria Police Force made sure that admission into the police colleges was regulated, so that in each region of Nigeria, you had policemen who came from the ethnic groups that belonged to that region. So in the east, for example, the ethnic groups that were found in the Nigeria Police Force were the Igbo, the Ijao, the Kalabari, and the So. In the west, the ethnic groups that were found in the police force were, of course, the Yoruba, the Bini, and the Itakiri, while in the north, the police force was mainly made up of Hausa/Fulani. Now, with those changing patterns of recruitment also came important developments when it comes to the training of African personnel, and most notable was the introduction of refresher courses at the different police colleges. The refresher courses started with the police college in Kaduna, which had just been opened in 1949. In Ikeja, the refresher courses were introduced right after training had been moved there from Enugu. All these refresher courses, which lasted about 3 to 4 months, were taken by up to 200 policemen. That was awesome, right? Refresher courses to improve the African policemen. Well, there was a catch. You see, the real reason behind these refresher courses was this. The men who took these courses were meant to provide the basis for the expansion of the riot control system. Evidence of the need for an effective riot control system had presented itself in the form of the Enugu Troubles of 1949. And we'll get into that. But apart from that, the whole of Africa was really changing after the Second World War. There was a development in the political consciousness of Africans. There was this sentiment of nationalism and the desire for self-rule, and the different police forces, not just the Nigeria police force, but different colonial police forces, were starting to prepare themselves for what might or might not happen, because there was anticipation for disturbances in some colonies. Another development that came after the Second World War was the Africanization of gazetted ranks in the Nigeria police force. From the beginning of colonial rule up until the interwar period, gazetted ranks such as assistant superintendent, superintendent, senior superintendent, all the way to commissioner, those were reserved for European personnel only. But starting during the war, and especially after the war, this began to change, and Africans slowly started making their way into these positions or into these ranks. In 1947, for example, there were 10 African assistant superintendents in the Nigeria police force. The first of those had risen to that rank in 1941 after serving 21 years in the Colonial Police. Obviously, since the Nigeria police force was established in 1930, this would imply that this man had served in the other colonial police forces before the amalgamation. In 1948, the first ever African gazetted officer was sent to Britain for training. From there, in the 1950s, a growing number of African non-gazetted officers, or those in the inspectorate ranks, were sent to Britain on 6-month courses that were meant to prepare them for the gazetted ranks. The last British career officer in the Nigeria police force was hired in 1955. After that, all British personnel coming into the Nigeria police force were hired on a contract basis. This was an indication that the British government, as well as the colonial government in Nigeria, were making arrangements for the eventual transfer of power to the Africans. A significant development in the Nigeria police force came in 1955 with the introduction of police women. In 1944, leaders of the Women's Party of Nigeria, an organization that sought equal rights for women, had approached the police commissioner and proposed that if women were hired into the police force, they would help with combating prostitution as well as dealing with female criminals. This was approved in 1955, and although the announcement had attracted a lot more women, only 20 of them were chosen and were sent for 6 months training at Ikeja. Part of their training included an introduction to Western clothing and footwear, and one can only assume that the reason for this was because traditional attire was not suitable for some of the activities involved in police work. Once they were done with their training, the 20 police women were stationed in Lagos, and their responsibilities mainly centered around administrative and office duties. Over time, the police women were introduced to regular patrol duties, but even then, their focus was mainly on issues relating to women and children. They were responsible for dealing with homeless children. Once the police women started to make it into the inspectorate ranks, they began to be posted to other parts of Nigeria like Enugu and Ibadan, instead of just being posted in Lagos. Then, in 1961, just a year after independence, 2 women were sent to Britain for training, and when they returned to Nigeria, they were promoted to gazetted ranks. From the late 1940s, all the way to independence in 1960, the Nigeria police force was engaged in different operations ranging from putting an end to secret society ritual killings to dealing with tensions emanating from different ethnic conflicts. One of the challenges faced by the Nigeria police, which I mentioned earlier, was the Enugu Troubles of 1949. Following a strike at the Enugu colliery, police reinforcements were dispatched from the north and west of Nigeria. In the process of trying to de-escalate the situation, some sort of misunderstanding occurred, and some of the northerner policemen fired their weapons without an order to do so. More than 40 Igbo coal mine workers were killed in the incident, and this led to riots in other parts such as Calabar, Onitsha, Aba, as well as Port Harcourt. Unfortunately, these riots too led to more police shootings as well as civilian casualties. In 1951, a dispute broke out in the Benin area between the Ogboni fraternity and an opposition group of villagers that called itself the Otu Edo Society. Although no shots were fired in this incident, the police remained in the area for about 2 months, and their presence deterred any further disturbances. Then, in 1953, there was a disturbance in the Oyo province where the rural dwellers were protesting the taxes that had been doubled. It appears that a shot was fired at the police, and in return, the police opened fire, killing one protester. A lot more of these disturbances would continue to occur throughout the 1950s and even after independence in October 1960. When you look at this history of the Nigeria police force and consider the fact that some of these riots and police shootings are still within living memory, it becomes easy to see why some people still feel like the Nigeria police force of today is colonial in its outlook, or that it resembles its colonial predecessor. I would like to conclude by saying that if you found value in this video and you'd like to see more, hit that subscribe button as well as the bell notifications. At the very least, leave this video a thumbs up, comment, and share. That was all for this episode. Please join me on the next one as we look at the history of the police in Zimbabwe. Until then, this has been Simon Bayani with Africa in Retrospect. Bye for now.